Between 1999 and 2015, the British Post Office prosecuted and convicted approximately 1,000 of its own subpostmasters and subpostmistresses for theft, fraud, and false accounting, with a further 50 to 60 prosecuted and not convicted. And in the years since, the public inquiry chaired by Sir Win Williams has identified 13 deaths by suicide that the families of those affected attribute to the scandal, plus dozens of other premature deaths of postmasters who never lived to see their convictions overturned. The inquiry has been careful to note that final causation has not been formally determined in every case. Some went to prison. Many lost their businesses, their savings, their homes, and their marriages. The Post Office told the courts repeatedly that the evidence was unambiguous. The Horizon computer system in the branch showed money missing. The subpostmaster had been the only one with access. The maths was the maths. The maths was not the maths. The Horizon system had bugs, and it had remote access functionality that the Post Office repeatedly told the courts did not exist. Internal documents later disclosed to the public inquiry show that senior staff inside the Post Office were warned by their own technical people and by an external review they had themselves commissioned that the system could and did produce false shortfalls. The prosecutions continued, the convictions stood for another decade, and the fight to undo them was led mostly by one man, a former subpostmaster from Northwest Wales called Alan Bates, who refused to settle when the Post Office offered him a small payment to go away. This is the story of what he found and what an institution looks like when it is allowed to be its own prosecutor. To understand the Horizon scandal, you have to understand what a Post Office subpostmaster is. There are, across the United Kingdom, roughly 11,500 post office branches. The largest are run directly by the Post Office, but most are smaller village shops, corner stores, suburban newsagents that contract with the Post Office to run a postal counter alongside their own business. The person who runs that counter is called the subpostmaster, and they are not Post Office employees in the ordinary sense. They are independent business people under contract. The contract has a clause in it. The subpostmaster is contractually liable for any shortfall the Post Office system reports at the end of the trading day, so that if the system says £100 is missing, the subpostmaster owes £100 and is expected to find the error or pay the difference out of their own pocket before the books close. For decades, this was a workable arrangement because the till receipts could be checked, the cash could be counted, and if the numbers did not add up, the postmaster could go back through the day's transactions and find where the error had happened. In 1999, the Post Office rolled out a new computerized accounting system called Horizon, supplied by a company called ICL, later renamed Fujitsu Services, which replaced the paper and till system across all 11,500 branches over the course of about 2 years. Horizon had bugs. The subpostmasters started seeing shortfalls, hundreds of pounds, thousands of pounds, in some cases tens of thousands, and they could not find where the money had gone. They called the Post Office helpline and were told that they were the only person in the country with this problem, that the system was robust, and that they had to pay back the missing money or they would be prosecuted. Most of them paid. The ones who could not pay were prosecuted. To understand how roughly 1,000 people came to be prosecuted on the evidence of a single computer system, you have to understand a peculiarity of British Post Office practice. Private prosecution, in England and Wales, has been generally available to any person or institution under the Prosecution of Offences Act of 1985. But most large public-facing organizations defer to the Crown Prosecution Service for the actual prosecutorial work. The Post Office did not. It operated for decades an in-house prosecution function at a scale that few, if any, other public-facing organizations have matched: investigators inside the Post Office, lawyers inside the Post Office, prosecutions filed in the Post Office's own name, so that the alleged victim of the offense, the investigator of the offense, the charging authority, and the prosecutor in court were all the same organization. In Scotland, Prosecutions were conducted by the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service on referrals from the Post Office, on a different and more conventional procedural footing. The defendant is, typically, a subpostmaster who has been running their branch for years, with no in-house lawyer, no detailed understanding of the Horizon system, and a generalist high-street solicitor with little or no expertise in IT forensics. Access to the Horizon source code, the audit logs, and independent technical evidence sat with the Post Office and Fujitsu, not with the defense. The defendant is being told, by the Post Office, that the system shows them taking money they know they did not take, and that other subpostmasters have had similar problems and have admitted to false accounting in order to avoid prison. The defendant pleads guilty to false accounting. They are sentenced to a fine, a community order, or, in the more serious cases, prison. They lose their post office contract. They lose, in many cases, the shop attached to the post office. The local newspaper carries the story, and the community treats them, for the rest of their lives, as a thief. This pattern repeats over the course of roughly 15 years, hundreds of times, with the Williams inquiry estimating that approximately 1,000 subpostmasters were prosecuted and convicted on Horizon evidence between 1999 and 2015. I want you to know some of their names. Seema Misra was a subpostmistress in West Byfleet, Surrey, sentenced by the Post Office's prosecution in November 2010, when she was 8 weeks pregnant at her sentencing, to 15 months in prison on a conviction for theft. She served approximately 4.5 months in Bronzefield Prison before being released. She gave birth to her son after release while under home detention curfew. Her conviction was quashed by the Court of Appeal in April 2021. The Court of Appeal, in quashing the conviction, found that the Post Office's case against her had relied on Horizon evidence presented to the trial court in a way the appeal court considered an affront to the conscience of the court. Jo Hamilton was a subpostmistress in South Warnborough, Hampshire, who, when she rang the Horizon helpline about a £2,000 shortfall, was told that she was the only person in the country with the problem. She tried to fix it. The shortfall grew. She mortgaged her house to pay it back. She pleaded guilty to false accounting in 2007 and was sentenced in 2008. Her conviction was overturned in 2021. Lee Castleton was a subpostmaster in Bridlington, East Yorkshire, who refused to pay back a Horizon-reported shortfall and whom the Post Office sued in the civil courts. He represented himself, lost, and was ordered to pay around £321,000 in costs, a figure that bankrupted him. The Castleton civil judgment of 2007 stood for years as a documented Post Office win on Horizon evidence and was cited internally as confirmation that the system would hold up in court. Noel Thomas was a subpostmaster in Garwin on the island of Anglesey, 61 years old when he was sent to prison. He had run the village post office for the best part of his working life, in a Welsh-speaking community where everybody who came in through the door knew him by name. There are roughly 1,000 of these names. I am not going to read them all. They are now in the public inquiry record. The list exists. Alan Bates is from a place called Craigwydon, on the outskirts of Llandudno in northwest Wales, where he took on the Craigwydon sub-post office in 1998, the year before Horizon was installed. By 2003, the system was showing shortfalls he could not account for, and he refused to pay them back, telling the post office, plainly and in writing, that he believed the system was wrong. In 2003, the post office terminated his contract. Bates did not plead guilty, he did not settle, and he did not in the years that followed stop writing letters. In 2009, he founded an organization called the Justice for Subpostmasters Alliance, whose members were other subpostmasters who had also been told they were the only ones in the country with this problem. The alliance grew slowly over the years that followed, as more subpostmasters found Bates through word of mouth, regional newspapers, and the trade press. Across that period, Bates kept records, post office letters, the names and contact details of every subpostmaster who reached out cross-referenced shortfalls. He corresponded with members of Parliament, briefed journalists, and supplied, in 2009, the documentary backbone for the Computer Weekly investigation that the journalist Carl Flinders began publishing that year. The first sustained press examination of Horizon as a possible cause of the shortfalls. The Post Office's posture throughout this period was that the cases were unrelated, that the system was robust, and that Mr. Bates was a disgruntled former contractor whose claims had no merit. In 2017, the Alliance, by now called the JFSA, filed a group claim in the High Court. The case was Bates and Others versus Post Office Limited. The lead claimant was Alan Bates. The judge was Mr. Justice Peter Fraser. The judgments he eventually handed down in 2019 are the documents that broke the case. On the 15th of March, 2019, Mr. Justice Fraser handed down what is known as the Common Issues Judgment, running to about 1,000 pages, which examined the contract under which subpostmasters operated and concluded that the Post Office's interpretation of that contract, including the absolute liability clause for any shortfall reported by Horizon, was not how the contract should be read in law. On the 16th of December, 2019, Mr. Justice Fraser handed down the Horizon Issues Judgment, running to several hundred pages, which examined the Horizon system itself and concluded, on the basis of expert evidence from independent computer scientists, that Horizon was not robust in the sense the Post Office had been asserting. It had bugs, it had remote access functionality. Fujitsu engineers could and did make changes to branch accounts without the subpostmaster's knowledge, which the Post Office had repeatedly denied in court. The system had, in short, been telling the courts something that was not true. In paragraph 929 of that judgment, Mr. Justice Fraser wrote a sentence that has since become the line everyone remembers. He wrote that the Post Office's position on Horizon was the 21st century equivalent of maintaining that the Earth is flat. The Post Office settled the civil claim shortly afterwards for £57.75 million across 555 claimants. But the funding model meant that much of the settlement went to legal costs and to a third-party litigation funder who had carried the case's financial risk, and individual claimants received, in the end, very small amounts. Many of them had lost very much more than that. The Court of Appeal began overturning the criminal convictions in 2021, beginning with a group of 39 appellants in April of that year, and the great majority of subpostmasters who brought individual appeals over the following 3 years had their convictions quashed. Many more had not appealed individually at all, and it was Parliament, not the courts, that ultimately legislated in 2024 to clear the remainder. Seema Misra's conviction was in that first April 2021 group of 39. The Court of Appeal quashed it 10 years and 5 months after the Post Office had stood up in court and told a Surrey judge that the system was reliable, that the maths was the maths, and that the 8 weeks pregnant subpostmistress in the dock should be sentenced to 15 months. 10 years and 5 months is, by any standard of institutional response, a long time. By the standard of a life lived through it, it is most of a childhood. The Post Office knew. The internal documents that have surfaced through the Sir Win Williams public inquiry, which was established in 2020 as a non-statutory review, upgraded to a full statutory inquiry in 2021, and which began its main hearings in 2022, show a pattern that is, in its careful sequencing across more than a decade, almost difficult to write about in measured prose. In 2010, a Post Office internal review identified the existence of remote access functionality in Horizon. The review went up to senior management. The Post Office continued in court to assert that remote access was not possible. In 2012, the Post Office commissioned an independent forensic accounting firm, Second Sight Support Services, to review Horizon. Second Sight reported that the system had bugs and that the Post Office's position on it was not defensible. The post office terminated Second Sight's contract before its work was complete and barred it from publishing what it had found. Across the years that followed, the post office's own technical and legal staff were warning senior management, in documents now in the inquiry record, that the legal position the post office was taking in court was at odds with what the people inside the building knew about the system. The legal position did not change. Paula Vennells served as chief executive of the post office from 2012 through 2019 and was awarded a CBE in 2019. On the 9th of January 2024, 8 days after the ITV drama Mr. Bates versus the post office was broadcast, she announced that she would return the honor. The honors forfeiture committee formally canceled and annulled the CBE the following month. Gareth Jenkins, a senior Fujitsu engineer, gave expert evidence to courts in multiple subpostmaster prosecutions, and the public inquiry has now established that Jenkins's evidence was incomplete. He knew of bugs in Horizon that were directly relevant to the cases on which he was testifying, and he did not disclose them. He is, as of the recording of this episode, the subject of a Metropolitan Police investigation into possible perjury and perverting the course of justice, although he has not been charged. The list of named individuals continues. The inquiry has examined the conduct of dozens of post office senior staff, dozens of Fujitsu engineers, several rounds of external lawyers, and the boards of both organizations. The Volume 1 inquiry report was published on the 8th of July 2025. The Volume 2 report, covering individual responsibility and recommendations, is, as of the recording of this episode, expected later in 2026. No criminal charges have yet been brought against any of the named senior individuals. On the 1st of January 2024, ITV broadcast a 4-part drama called Mr. Bates versus the Post Office, which told the story of Alan Bates and the Alliance, used real names, and quoted real documents. By the end of the first week of January, the British government was facing a political crisis of an order that few people would have predicted 6 months earlier. The Prime Minister's office announced emergency legislation, and the Post Office, Horizon System Offences, Act received royal assent in May 2024. The Act applies to relevant offences alleged in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland between September 1996 and December 2018. It quashes the affected convictions automatically, and it excludes convictions that had already been considered on appeal by the Court of Appeal. Scotland passed its own equivalent legislation in the same year. The legislation was unusual. It is rare for Parliament to quash criminal convictions by statute. It was the right answer. It was also the answer that, in a functional institutional system, should not have been necessary because the convictions should not have happened. The compensation schemes, there are now several with different acronyms, covering different categories of claimant, are still being administered. As of the most recent published government data, a substantial number of individual subpostmasters are still waiting for what they are owed. Some have died waiting. The legal fees being charged by external lawyers to administer the compensation schemes have become, in their own right, the subject of a secondary controversy. Multiple compensation lawyers and the Justice for Subpostmasters Alliance have argued in public that the administrative cost has been allowed to run very large against a body of claimants whose underlying losses were, in many cases, in the tens of thousands. The compensation, designed to make people whole, has been rooted, in significant part, around them. This is not unusual for British public administration redress schemes. It is recognizable. It is also a reminder that the Horizon scandal is not, as a public administration matter, over. The convictions have been quashed. The institutional architecture that produced them, the in-house prosecution function, the absolute liability clause, the absence of external technical review of evidence offered against private individuals in court, has been reviewed but not, as of the recording of this episode, structurally replaced. The mirror to this story is the smallpox program. The smallpox program was a narrow institution with a specific, measurable task: eradicate one disease, and it was held to account by results. When its initial mass vaccination strategy was struggling in the field, its senior staff in Geneva recognized the limits of that approach and adopted a different one, because the institution was small enough, technical enough, and accountable enough to know what was working and what was not. Cases either appeared in the surveillance data or they did not. Vaccination either broke transmission or it did not. The numbers on the page either fell or they kept rising. An institutional posture at odds with the field data, sustained for 14 years, would have been very hard to maintain in a program built that way. The post office, by contrast, was a vague institution. It ran an in-house prosecution function at a scale that few, if any, other public-facing organizations have matched, a function that nobody in modern Whitehall had structurally reviewed in decades, and it offered no external auditor for its technical assertions in court, because those technical assertions concerned an IT system that the post office itself owned, and that nobody outside the post office was contractually entitled to inspect. It was led, in its most consequential decade, by a chief executive with no engineering training, Paula Vennells, who has told the public inquiry that she relied on what was reported to her by post office technical and legal staff inside the building. The institutional architecture above her had no mechanism for hearing the people: Alan Bates, the subpostmasters, the computer weekly journalists, Mr. Justice Fraser, who could see from outside the building that the system was lying. A narrow institution allowed to be measured is the architecture that ended smallpox. A vague institution allowed to be its own prosecutor is the architecture that destroyed around 1,000 lives. There is no law of physics that says a state-owned monopoly with prosecutorial powers will eventually behave the way the post office behaved, and there is no necessary cultural feature of British public administration that produces a horizon. The institutional design choices that produced it, the absolute liability clause in the subpostmaster contract, the in-house prosecution function, the absence of any external review of the technical claims made in court, were design choices. They were made. They could have been unmade much earlier than they were. The lesson the smallpox program leaves us with is not, in the end, about smallpox. It is about what good institutional design looks like, and what bad institutional design looks like, and how long the second one can run when nobody is allowed to ask whether the system is telling the truth. Alan Bates is, by some distance, the moderatrite hero of British public life of the early 21st century. He did not run for office. He did not raise venture capital. He did not seek the role he ended up filling. There is an instinct, when an institutional failure on the scale is laid out, to look for a single villain who can be made to carry the weight. The post office horizon story does not give us one. The Fraser judgments did not. The Williams inquiry has not. The structure failed first. The contract, the in-house prosecution function, the absence of external technical review, the assumption that the system could not be wrong because the institution had said it was not, and the senior individuals defended the structure long after the documents in front of them ought to have changed their minds. The Volume 2 inquiry report, when it arrives, will name those individuals. The criminal investigation continues. The Metropolitan Police has been examining files since 2020. No charges have yet been brought. The compensation schemes are still paying. The subpostmasters who lost houses, businesses, marriages, and in some cases years of liberty are still rebuilding what was taken from them. A computer system told a court that the money was missing. The court believed the computer. The post office believed the computer. The subpostmaster, who had been there, who knew the maths could not be right, was told that the computer did not lie. The computer lied. It lied because the institution wrapped around it had been built in a way that could not hear the people who could see that it was lying. Seema Misra was sentenced to 15 months, served approximately 4.5 months at Bronzefield Prison before her release on home detention curfew, and gave birth to her son after that release. Her conviction was quashed by the Court of Appeal in April 2021, more than 10 years after she had been sent down. She has spoken publicly since, about what it took to rebuild a life around the absence of those years. She still operates a sub-post office. Alan Bates lives in Llandudno. He was made a knight in the 2024 King's Birthday Honors. The Justice for Subpostmasters Alliance still meets. The compensation schemes are still paying. The criminal investigation continues. The wait for many of the named subpostmasters is now in its third decade. He spent 15 years writing letters, organizing meetings in cold rooms in mid-Wales, and refusing to settle when the institution that had ruined his livelihood offered him a small payment to go away. The institution above him had failed. He was, for a long time, the only working accountability the system had. He should not have had to be.